Welcome everyone to Ratioed. My name is Harrison Faulkner. Well, if you're reading Canada's state-sponsored propaganda outlet, the CBC, over the weekend, or if you were reading one of Canada's many legacy media state-funded newspapers like the Toronto Star, or perhaps if you were watching one of Canada's failing TV news stations like Global News or our favorite news station over at Ratioed, that being CTV News, you would have no idea that the biggest story of the year, the most important free speech story of a generation, dropped on Friday. I'm talking about Matt Taibbi's bombshell reporting on the Twitter files. Now, we all know that Twitter and Facebook were involved in censoring the Hunter Biden laptop story. Everybody knows that. But what we didn't know was just how much influence the DNC and the Biden campaign had on Twitter staff to censor content they didn't like. And also what we didn't know was how willing Twitter was to censor content on their platform, well, because they just felt like it. So why should this matter to you and why should it matter to Canadians? Well, it's quite simple, really. Canadian legacy media have outright refused to cover this story. They refuse to acknowledge the fact that we now know exactly what Twitter was doing. We know exactly how much influence Joe Biden had on Twitter during the campaign, and yet no journalist in Canada seems willing to write about this story. I wonder why that could be. Could it be perhaps that it goes against their narrative? Now, we definitely know it's not for a lack of interest in American news. I mean, the CBC writes slanderous articles against Donald Trump almost every single day. Just go to their front page. But for whatever reason, this story that doesn't shine the best light on Joe Biden is not getting any coverage. And with Bill C-11 right around the corner, online censorship needs to be at the front of mind for Canadians. Whether it be from a social media company or whether it be from the state, it's all the same. It is an attack on your free speech and it needs to be confronted. And journalists should be asking these questions. I wonder why they're not. Drop a like in the video, help us out by subscribing to the True North YouTube channel, and the comment question for the episode is this: is legacy media journalism dead? Let me know in the comments what you think. All right, let's get into it. So let's dive into the Twitter files before we get into the reaction, or better yet, the lack of reaction from Canada's legacy media, and then we get into the negative reaction from American journalists who seem to be crying over the fact that Matt Taibbi, an independent journalist, broke this story. They're now accusing him of running PR for the richest man in the world. That's quite rich coming from journalists who write for the Washington Post. And we're also going to get into what we don't know, because to me, that's the most interesting part of this reporting. It's the fact that Matt Taibbi's reporting now opens the door to a whole potential of other stories, of other instances in which Twitter has engaged in political influence on their platform. This could really snowball, and it could really snowball fast. So the Twitter files may be the first big piece of journalism to be published exclusively on Twitter. Matt Taibbi wrote this entire tweet thread as his reporting, which is, in my opinion, a fascinating turn in journalism. Oh, and also, just a few days before Matt Taibbi dropped this bombshell, he teamed up with Douglas Murray to absolutely crush the mainstream media in a Monk debate. Take a look at this score. Him and Douglas Murray managed to flip the downtown Toronto Roy Thomson Hall audience into completely rejecting mainstream media. It was an absolutely perfect performance against a very weak, washed-up Malcolm Gladwell and some no-name New York Times columnists. But that's just a bit of a side story. Let's get into these Twitter files, because that's the real story here. In a long 30-tweet Twitter thread, Matt Taibbi starts dropping internal communications between Twitter staff during the 2020 election. Take a look at this. By 2020, requests from connected actors to delete tweets were routine. One executive would write to another, "More to review from the Biden team." The reply would come back, "Handled." This message comes in with 5 or 6 tweets to be deleted, to be censored on behalf of the Biden campaign. Just incredible stuff. Celebrities or unknowns alike could be removed or reviewed at the behest of a political party. And then you have this message: "I grabbed the first one under SI, defer to safety on the high-profile second one." So Twitter was taking orders from political campaigns to remove tweets and censor accounts because, well, the campaigns wanted them to be censored. So that's part of the new information that we didn't know about Twitter's censoring of the Hunter Biden laptop story. It wasn't just the story itself. It wasn't just the New York Post reporting. It was content that the campaigns wanted removed or completely censored. It was random tweets. It was tweets from unknown accounts, or it was tweets from celebrities. Campaigns had this influence to just outright remove content that they didn't want on the platform. Now, in Matt's reporting, it actually shows that Trump and Biden were both able to do this. They were both able to censor content on Twitter, but it came down to connections. It came down to how many people inside Twitter were on your side and how much were they willing to help you out. And of course, who could have guessed? Twitter was leaning Biden. What a surprise there. As Taibbi points out in this tweet, this system wasn't balanced. It was based on contacts. Because Twitter was and is overwhelmingly staffed by people of one political orientation, there were more channels, more ways to complain, open to the left, well, Democrats, than the right. Here you can see data from Open Secrets. 99.7% of Twitter employees who made political contributions sent their money to the Democrats. 99.73%. So if we're really talking about which campaign is going to have the benefit of censoring content, it's going one way and one way only. So this is where the Hunter Biden laptop story from the New York Post comes in. And a quick summary of the reporting is very important before we go any further. The New York Post dropped a bombshell report on October 14th, 2020. This report was damaging to Joe Biden's presidential campaign because using emails obtained from Hunter Biden's laptop, the New York Post was able to connect the dots and confirm that Hunter Biden had introduced then Vice President Joe Biden to Ukrainian business contacts while Hunter Biden was serving on the board of the energy company Burisma. And then less than a year after that introduction, Joe Biden as vice president pressured the Ukrainian government into firing the prosecutor investigating the company that executive worked for. So you can see why this reporting was not something that Joe Biden wanted circulating on Twitter. So Joe Biden and Joe Biden's campaign, which we now know from Matt Taibbi's reporting, wrote to Twitter to have this story censored. And what did Twitter do? Well, we know what they did. They completely shut down the story, labeled it as misinformation, and stopped anyone from DMing the article on their platform. You could not privately share the article to anyone else. United States legacy media, including Canadian legacy media, ran with the narrative that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. It was a cooked-up Kremlin plot to try and lower Joe Biden's chances to become president of the United States at the benefit of Donald Trump. As time went on, after Joe Biden became president, as the 2020 election faded into the rearview mirror, legacy media outlets in the United States who were running with the Russian disinformation narrative slowly began to confirm the story as true. 769 days after initially calling the Hunter Biden laptop story Russian disinformation, CBS News confirmed the Hunter Biden laptop story to be true. And the same exact thing happened with the New York Times and the Washington Post in March 2022. So we know the Hunter Biden laptop story to be true. We know the contents in those emails to be verified. And don't take my word for it, take it from the New York Times. But during the election, when it mattered, when the story really could have had an influence, Twitter interfered. Twitter meddled in the election and censored that story. So let's go back to Taibbi's reporting on this. He writes this: Twitter took extraordinary steps to suppress the story, removing links and posting warnings that it may be unsafe. They even blocked its transmission via direct message, a tool hitherto reserved for extreme cases. White House spokeswoman Kayleigh McEnany was locked out of her account for tweeting about the story, prompting a furious letter from the Trump campaign staffer Mike Hahn, who seethed, at least pretend to care for the next 20 days. So they censored the White House spokeswoman for sharing a true, factual story during the election campaign. If that's not election meddling, if that's not election interference, I don't know what is. So all of this now brings us to what we don't know. What we don't know is how many other times Twitter has used this tactic of censoring content, censoring information, because someone has told them to do it. Whether it be a political candidate, whether it be a world leader, whether it be a company has told them to suppress information. Remember that at the beginning of COVID, you would be censored on Twitter. You'd be locked out of your account on Twitter if you dared to talk about the lab leak theory for COVID-19, if you dared to allege that perhaps COVID came from a Wuhan lab. The same thing would happen on Facebook. So what else have they been up to? What else has Twitter been up to? That's the big question that any real journalist would start asking. But so far, nothing. Nothing at all. Let's take a look actually at what Canadian media are reporting on, if at all. Let's take a look at what Global News is reporting. Seems quiet over there. What about CTV News? Perhaps the state propaganda outlet, the CBC. Oh, wait a second. What's this story here? Here we go. Trump condemned after calling for partial termination of Constitution over his election lie. Seems like not what we're looking for. However, the CBC, along with the Globe and Mail, decided to pick up this story from the Associated Press. No Canadian journalist was willing to write this story, obviously, so they picked up a story from an American wire news service, the Associated Press. You're probably thinking to yourself, well, this is another Trump attack article. Why is he bringing this up to us right now? Well, as a matter of fact, the Associated Press did mention the Twitter files. Only 10 paragraphs buried into this story and completely botched. Take a look at this. Trump's comments came after Twitter's new owner, Elon Musk, said he would reveal how Twitter engaged in free speech suppression. See how they use scare quotes for that free speech suppression? Not like, of course, it was actual free speech suppression, right? That wasn't free speech suppression. Quote, free speech suppression leading up to the 2020 election. But files released Friday, which focused on the tech company's confused response to a story about Biden's son Hunter, do not show Democrats trying to limit the story. Excuse me, Associated Press, that's not the story. Have you been paying attention? The story is not Democrats trying to suppress the story. The story is Twitter suppressing the story. Obviously, that's what we're talking about. Obviously, this is free speech suppression by a social media company, not the Democrats. Obviously, the Democrats wouldn't want the story. The Republicans wouldn't want the story if it was about Trump. And I would call out this journalist, but the CBC hides who it is. They just say it's from the Associated Press. Classic. Now, to be fair, I could find one Canadian newspaper writing the story, the Toronto Sun, the conservative newspaper. Shocker. So what you have here is a journalist working independently, telling the truth, breaking a massive story, and exposing political corruption inside social media companies. A big story, a very important story. And in a different era, perhaps, journalists who didn't report the story might say to themselves, well, that is a great piece of journalism. I'm really glad that someone was able to do it because after all, our job collectively is to speak truth to power. But instead, of course, what did we get? We got a bunch of lefty legacy media journalists in the US crying over this story, trying to do everything they can to delegitimize Taibbi's reporting and attacking him for telling the truth. This is from New York Times writer Wajahat Ali. Matt Taibbi. What sad, disgraceful downfall. I swear, kids, he did good work back in the day. Should be a cautionary tale for everyone. Selling your soul for the richest white nationalist on earth. Well, he'll eat well for the rest of his life, I guess. But is it worth it? Elon Musk, a white nationalist? And leave it to a New York Times journalist to talk down to his Twitter followers as kids. Of course it's from the New York Times. They think they're so much better than us. This is from woke, unhinged lunatic MSNBC host Mehdi Hassan. Imagine volunteering to do online PR work for the world's richest man on a Friday night, in service of nakedly and cynically right-wing narratives, and then pretending you're speaking truth to power. Take a look at this from the NBC reporter Ben Collins. Imagine throwing it all away to do PR work for the richest person in the world. Humiliating. If breaking the biggest online free speech story in a generation is bad for your journalistic credibility, what does working for NBC News do? I can only imagine. This report from Taibbi was just the first in what is predicted to be a series of reports coming from Matt over the next few days, exposing more of what's been going on behind the scenes at Twitter. We're going to be following it at True North, unlike the legacy media journalists who want nothing to do with it. That's going to do it for us this week on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratio.